And before we start anything else, I would like to I want to read very quickly something that I think is very important for what we're doing, and that is to talk about what we're considered the genuine letters of Paul. So these are Galatians, First Thessalonians, First Corinthians, Second Corinthians, Romans, Philippians, and Philemon. So these epistles are the ones who are pretty much considered universally, well, mostly amongst New Testament scholars as being the actual products of Paul the Apostle. However, there is quite a bit of debate about Colossians, Ephesians, and Colossians, Ephesians, and there's a third one, Philippians. So these are often called pseudo-Paul, and they're written as a form of pseudo-epigrapha. And what that means very practically is pseudo-epigrapha is things written under a pseudonym. And in the first century, those are not necessarily, they're not trying to lie per se. It was more of an attempt to say that this is in the style of or in keeping with. And that is sort of controversial for us today when we think about it, but in the time period, it was not. And I would say that the reason that we have, particularly the book of Ephesians, is because there are gaps in Paul's writings that others were so uncomfortable with they wanted to fill. So with that, and I think that we'll find several of those. And thinking about that moment that we have one of the greatest articulators of Christianity, but who caused so many issues back in his day that literally there was a sort of cottage industry of responses. One of which was Gnosticism, which 30 years ago that was a really radical claim. Now it's entered much more into the mainstream of New Testament studies. So let's start and let me see here. What am I doing? Um, okay, I'll start there. So everyone should see this, but we're going over here. And yeah, because we're dealing with something that is so complicated, so difficult, I really had to go back to my whole scripting. And as I said, I forgot to include that bit about what's authentic Paul and what's not, but that's really, really important as we're going through this, and I'll reiterate that several times. So to start, in going over the material I wanted to include in this lecture, I realized that I not only had one lecture well enough, but the material for at least four more. And so this is really the beginning of our Pauline year, which is strange for Swedenborgians. But I hope that we'll have you back for more of them. And the reason that I think that this is also a good idea is because I don't want to rush any of the discussion that we're going to have tonight. And I really would like it to be a discussion. So if anyone has a question midway, just let me know. So Paul is without a doubt the most consequential and controversial articulators of the Christian message ever. And that writings attributed to him make up 48% of the New Testament. And some would say, and I think that this was a consensus opinion, particularly amongst 19th century scholars, that Paul was in fact the founder of Christianity. Yet, for all his familiarity, his ideas and the complexity of his thought continue to spark disagreements among scholars as to what is the best context through which to understand Paul, both his message and the persons he is writing for. And that's where we want to start tonight. So, was he a Jewish thinker? Was he the first convert to not the Jesus movement, which is a messianic Jewish sect, but to Christianity? Or was he more Greek than Jewish? And this is sort of a silly way of taking this, but when you look at the worldview that he's writing to and writing from, this is a very important question. Now we're having what I'm going to do tonight. So I would like to consider Paul from within the theme of his own intellectual and developmental background as a member of a specific group of Hellenized Jews of Asia Minor. And as this lecture continues, we will understand all of the complexities that go along with that. So thus we will consider his thought, Paul's thought, in the relation to the tradition of pagan monotheism, and at very least, as well as pagan philosophy, Greek philosophy, Stoicism, Epicureanism, and the teachings of Empedocles. And at the very least, we also want to introduce the fact that Paul's writings have an inherent tension with the Jerusalem church, led by the brother of Jesus, James the Just. And we'll talk about that very soon. So, needless to say, we are promoting, as I've said before, a critical view of Paul's writings. And in the final lecture of this series that I'm developing, we will consider Paul from a Swedenborgian perspective. And I think that that is one of the more interesting things because Paul, the Swedenborgian tradition is one of the very few Christian traditions, and perhaps the only Protestant tradition that does not centralize Paul. Do not at all. And I think that that is a very interesting perspective. So wait for that. That'll be fun. And the next section in this particular series will be Paul through the glass darkly, curating the apostle, self-perception, and the optics of conversion. Because although we're going to reference a little bit about Paul's conversion experience here, just in the way that he frames a lot of his arguments, that really is something that needs to be discussed in and of itself. And we also will not be sort of going along with him in terms of where he changes his name, which will also be discussed. So there won't be a discussion of Saul. We're talking about Paul pretty much exclusively in this lecture, and we'll discuss the reasons why in the next one. So I want to give an overarching idea this evening that Paul's understanding of the Jesus event owes more to his Hellenistic background than that of his supposed education in the Pharisaic tradition. In fact, as we'll talk about, Paul shows very little familiarity with the Pharisaic perspective of Judaism. Paul was able to merge Judaic apocalypticism, exclusivism, and messianism into a worldwide religion, which would come to eclipse both the Jewish and pagan context which gave birth to it. Paul would furthermore introduce a psychological and world-rejecting element in the essentials of the Christian faith, which is quite alien to the Jewish tradition, and which, as Elaine Pagels and others have argued, would be a major foundation for later Gnostic movements, specifically Christian Gnostics. And that's another can of worms in and of itself if we're going to start talking about how we define Gnosticism. But let's say specifically Valentinian Gnosticism. A point pointed out, in fact, as I will likely discuss and continue in the next lecture, the figure of the conversion in Damascus was likely a result of trying to claim some kind of relationship with mainstream Pharisaic Judaism in the period. But I think that that is a fictitious account, or at the very least a highly, I guess you would call, there's a word that I'm somehow blanking on, but it was certainly a very highly elaborated story, I will say. So, where we want to begin is actually the latter part of his name, where he often called himself Paul of Tarsus. So though we have no real way of knowing when Paul's family would have arrived in Tarsus, and here you can see it, it was the capital of the Roman province of Cilicia. The Jewish, so we don't know when his family would have arrived in Tarsus, but we do know that around Paul's birth in circa 5 AD, the Jewish population of Tarsus had already been there for some time, and that the community was already established before the coming of Alexander the Great and the Seleucid dynasty, 300 years before Paul's birth. And as a diaspora community, the Jews of Tarsus were used to walking in two distinct cultural spheres, which denotes actually they had more than one identity, and this is not unusual for for diaspora Jewish communities, as the Jewish community on Elephanta shows in Egypt. So they had two identities really, one Hellenic and later Roman, and the other one Jewish. And I should also say that in this time, the Jewish identity was also not set in stone. And there were several perspectives on what Jewishness meant in, in quite shocking ways, really. As other Jewish diaspora communities, the Jewish populace of Tarsus would have been very familiar with theological and ideological developments amongst their pagan neighbors. And judging from Paul's writings, he seems to have been summarily familiar with the language of the Hellenic world, as well as its ideological structure. The most brilliant image of this is his speech in the Areopagus. But Paul, however, tried to distance himself from his Hellenic background, as we find here in Acts 22:3. I'm a Jew born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in the city at the feet. In this city, they were in Jerusalem, at the feet of Gamaliel. Very difficult thing to say. Educated strictly according to our ancestral law, being zealous for God, just as all of you are here today. However, there are many reasons to question this actually. So one, the koine from this particular chapter is most likely from a later compilation of the book, and one which is concerned with the apostolic crisis of Paul. And this is what I'm describing as Paul's sense for his own apostolic mission. You had all of the other apostles who knew Jesus, and in fact, apostles mean, the apostle, one of the earliest things that distinguished an apostle was they were someone who knew Jesus in real life. So that's a very important part. And so, and thus the statement about him being raised at the feet of Gamaliel, who was a very significant figure in the time, is probably not accurate. And in fact, this story, as I've said, is trying to present Paul as more Pharisaic than he is. So let's talk about Gamaliel for a second. There is no evidence of his familiarity with either Gamaliel's teachings, which were emphatically legal. So Gamaliel was interested, for instance, in which fish you should eat and not eat. And he was of a very high echelon. So he wasn't really a teaching rabbi that we know of. And we know quite a bit about him because of all the Midrashic literature. So there is no evidence of Paul's familiarity with Gamaliel, or the Pharisaic movement itself. Gamaliel's presence in Midrashic literature is well known, but he is not thought to have any personal students. There's certainly an unknown, and as this is a practice more associated with post-Second Temple Judaism. It also seems highly unlikely that Gamaliel would have had any thoughts about Jewish sectarianism. Remember, in the book of Acts, he's also shown to be the Jewish teacher who had a great deal of sympathy for the Christian movement. But as I've said, considering how early this is and Gamaliel's understanding about civic society, that just doesn't really square with the time frame. So, and he was also, as I've said, in the highest echelons of Jewish society, the Sanhedrin. So a lot of these sort of more popular discussions, which all messianism was always a popular front, that is sort of, it seems very unlikely that a court Sanhedrin Pharisee would be really interested in these debates. And as I've said previously, he was very interested in kashrut theory, the theory of kosherness, specifically within Palestinian Jews in the Holy Land. And as I've said, he was focused primarily, in terms of his legal representation on dietary law. So, what was Paul's Jewish background? If he's not Pharisaic, then what is he? So I would say that he was part of a much more populous tradition, which had widespread appeal across the Jewish diaspora. And it was grounded in a universalist interpretation of the Torah, meaning, believing that God is the God of all the world, which did sort of strange things in the Roman period. And it was strongly connected with apocalypticism, that time was coming to an end, popular religiosity, teachers, rabbis that were going around, mistroi, these people that were healing and bringing miracles. This would have been most likely his background, and that looks very different from Pharisaic Judaism. So I would say that that's probably where he came from. And that we find everywhere in Paul, but very little formal Pharisaic Judaism. So Paul's familiarity with the Roman law and Greek religion is also a good reason. So if you wanted to sort of look at it, these first two are reasons why he probably wasn't raised in a strong tradition or a son of Gamaliel. And here is some of the positive reasons why. So one, we have his familiarity, as I've said, with Greek law, Greek philosophy, Roman law, Roman philosophy, and particularly the rights of Roman citizens, which are another really interesting point, which also seems to suggest that he wouldn't have moved as early to be raised in Jerusalem, but we'll talk about that soon. So he has all of this familiarity with these different groups, and he also, at least at 2 points, references the Homeric tradition, Stoicism, the followers of Zeno of Cratias, a name for the Zoa, the Stoa, the stairs where they sat, the columns where they sat in Athens. And he also exhibits a very strong background in Platonic philosophy. And, as Matthew Sharp has shown, he would have also known a great deal about popular divination. And finally, Paul's familiarity with the Torah. It is not revealing so much Aramaic Hebrew sources, but a lot of Greek influence. And by this time, the Septuagint Bible would have already been produced, about 100 years before his birth, or various translations of it. And it certainly was the primary text that Jewish diaspora communities would have known about. So there's this linguistic barrier, and probably he did know Hebrew, but it certainly would not have been, you can surmise, the same caliber as people raised in the Midrashic system. So why is it, though, so important that we press to acknowledge Paul's background in Tarsus? And I think one of the most significant is the fact that Paul himself says that he is from Tarsus. And he makes this very interesting statement in Acts 21:39. Paul answered, I am a Jew from Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people. Now, this reference is because Tarsus in Paul's time was only surpassed by Rome and Athens as centers of learning. They had a very large temple. They had several schools. There were actually very famous philosophers who traveled there, both from the Near East and from what we would call the Zoroastrian areas of Persia, who traveled through Asia Minor and came through there. So there was a lot going on, so to say. And Paul, he starts to say that he is of Tarsus because he is claiming this background for himself as well. And also, this seems to me to tell very early, at least they say he goes back to Tarsus. And I think that's in latter response to the fact that he was probably raised there, came to Jerusalem very seldomly, and actually left to go back to Tarsus. So they try to say, well, he was, raised in Jerusalem, but I think there's much more of Tarsus in him than Jerusalem. So this is exceptionally important as it helps to frame all of the theology he would advocate. A zealous Jew committed to the truth and is struck down with a conviction by the powerful image of Jesus was rhetorically more convincing than a Hellenized Jew attempting to bridge Jewish messianism using archetypes drawn from pagan philosophy, especially its cosmic universalism. Tarsus is also important as it was a polis of a great renown during the period. And the polis was an odd spot to be in for its Jewish residents, as Paula Fredrickson has shown in this quote. But in the Roman period, avatars of the polis, these Hellenic gods, structured civic and cultural life. Through the works in shaping the literary canon, Homer, first of all, the classical playwrights, the work of Hellenistic grammarians and rhetoricians, these gods mediated paideia, higher education, thus culture. For both science and philosophy, they structure and organize the physical universe. And our planet still answers to the names of many of these, Jupiter, Saturn, etc. And thus we find from the Jewish Septuagint, do not revile the gods, counseled Moses in the Septuagint account of Exodus 22:28. In commenting on this verse, Philo noted that such courtesy promoted peace, since reviling each other's gods always causes war. And Philo went on to add that Moses thereby enjoined respect for pagan rulers who, according to the poets, of the same seed as the gods. This was a very important trope in the Greek religion. And some Hellenistic Jews, in brief, advised and even advocated that Jews show a certain respect for their neighbors' pantheons. This particular literature involves Jewish discussions with God-fearers, which were a sect of monotheistic pagans, which is a very interesting group. And there weren't like one sect, there were many different groups. But very often these were attracted to Jewish tradition as, in the time, one of the most well-known monotheistic faiths, and very widespread. The diaspora was quite large, even in the early, even during the Hellenic period, very large, very early disbursement. And people thought it was both exotic and they were very attracted to this form of monotheism. And furthermore, unlike real Pharisees who were interested in understanding concepts like messianic redemption, universalism, and the apocalypse in very rigidly Jewish ways, Paul was searching for what it meant, not in the midrashic sense, but in the cosmic sense of Christ's appeal, of Christ's appearance. Said otherwise, there is more Plato in him than Gamaliel, and his work was unbelievably well received, a point that was not always well received by pagan audiences, and a point that was not always and in all places accepted as something good. In fact, as we will see with his discussions of Peter, etc., this sort of pagan reception led a lot of Jewish writers to be quite concerned about what Paul was saying, and thus this tension. Like his pagan compatriots, Paul was committed to understanding the cosmic significance of the Christ event. And as the beginning, and this event is the beginning of a new way of being in the world, and one which had many more points of contacts with the experience of late Republic Hellenized Romans than it did with any of the advocates or teachers of Palestinian Judaism, who were still very interested in biblical formulations of everything. And particularly, what does the law do in this time? That was a very important point for Pharisees. And finally, what enraged so many of the early followers of the Jesus movement was that he imported, or they felt he imported, many of these highly sophisticated arguments drawn from Greek culture to pronounce his own teachings as the only one of validity for Christians, all others being anathema. And now I give you the famous quote from Romans 1:6-9. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another gospel, but there are some who are confusing you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should proclaim to you a gospel contrary to what we proclaim to you, let that one be accursed. Let them be cast out, reviled, torn asunder. As we said before, so now I repeat, if anyone proclaims to you a gospel contrary to what you have received, let that one be accursed. So why is he so exceptionally, why is he holding to this so strongly? So it is also exceptionally impertinent to this discussion that this anathema is proclaimed directly before he validates his own apostleship as being not from man. So on verse 10, he takes up again, I'm not chosen from man, I'm chosen by God directly. However, there were many, as this statement shows, and he's writing against these people, who did question how it was that he spoke alone for the Lord, especially that he did not know Jesus, and how it was that he had the one accurate understanding of the Christian message, which is the only implication that he has here, and was not in line with all of the message that was being presented by Palestinian Judaism, which was much less interested in all of the theological insights, but in promoting, the way that, for instance, the communal celebration was much more important, much more centralized. And Paul is bringing everything to a much higher level of thought. As I've said, this uncertainty about his status is the perpetual crisis from which Paul interprets his own apostolic mission. And it is the matrix where he sees where he sees the redemption of all creation through this point of crisis. However, his philosophical eclecticism was a poor spot for some of the Jewish Christians, and even his radical dimensions were too constricting for some of the more philosophically inclined. By the way, he talks against Judaizers and the Corinthians, who were the opposite. They were antinomians, saying, well, in Christ there is no law. And both of those extremes can be read from certain things that he said. And this tension that follows Paul is his concern for his apostolic standing also leads him in a tension between his universalizing cosmic elements and his direct engagement with the Jewish tradition. This is especially significant as he develops his soteriology, in which there is an inconsistency between Christ's cosmic restoration, which is a concern of particularly his writings in Corinthians, with the notion of substitutionary atonement, which he advocated for in Romans. Like Paul, we should take a few moments to reflect on the cosmic retelling of the Messianic event. For most of normative Judaism's history, the Messianic redemption would be one of imminent physical change. This world. Nothing beyond it. The nations of the world would be subjugated, the land of Israel freed from foreign occupation, and a new order based on the leadership of God's anointed. And there is very little for the type of symbolization which Paul attempts and undertakes in the Jewish cosmos as it was understood by Palestinian Judaism. And thus we have the influence of alternative cosmologies, notably Stoicism, but there are others. And so I want to look at a very specific example of this. And I'm calling this particular part redemption as cosmic rupture, change in the very elements of the cosmos. Though early on in the history of the Jesus movement, there were prayers to Jesus, said by both those of the Jewish background and from without, textual evidence supports this tendency was actually at the very beginning of the Jesus movement and was certainly widespread by the 3rd century. And we see here that this is a Mosaic text that says only, which says this is only for the Lord, for the deity Jesus. Very, very interesting point. And this comes from Megiddo. So I only mention this to say that the majority of those interested in the Jesus movement believed that the coming of Jesus had a cosmological significance. Most people did. However, none articulated it with such an alertness to contemporary concerns as Paul did, and those concerns, as I will say again, were primarily pagan. Knowing that Paul came from an exceptionally Hellenized background helps us to understand indeed why he was able to achieve such widespread and lasting theological imprints, especially as the majority of the people that would come to the Christ movement were former pagans. However, that does not mean that he kept an internally consistent view of the Christ event. In fact, from the textual elements we have in the New Testament, we can prove that this was not the case. As scholars like Bart Ehrman have shown, there has been a great deal of damage, violence in his term, to the text itself in order to make it fit within certain orthodox mind spread. And the book that he wrote is The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture. So this is certainly true in terms of Paul's Christotheology, which due to its complexity would be later addressed by the pseudo-Pauline letters of Colossians and Ephesians, Ephesians especially. Ephesians is sort of written in answer to sort of fleshing out Paul's cosmology, and the roots of which we will now presently examine. And I just want to say that I relied primarily on Van Coten's book, The Cosmic Christology, which it's perhaps the most exhaustive study about the relation of Christ with Hellenic philosophy. So the cosmos for Paul was an exceptionally Hellenized space, where several alternate powers and power structures vied for domination. And he actually uses the term slavery here, the same way he would refer to himself later as a slave of Jesus. So, very important point. And in some ways, he sees the redemption event as a restructuring of the cosmos, which are now no longer held in accordance with the powers that be, and this is namely elemental theory, but was in fact by God. But he also imports, and I do say import, a very controversial idea about daimones, demons, which was not universally shared amongst Jewish followers, particularly of the most conservative forms of Palestinian Judaism, which we would call the Sadducean movement. So it was this very Hellenized space, and humans were enslaved to archon being governors of cities in the Hellenic world, and they're the sort of powers that be, and he will refer to them the powers of the air, etc., as well as the all-important slavery of the elements. Ta stoikeia toi kosomo, as you are taken by the elements. So Paul's ideas about the oppression by the elements, which has very little grounding in Second Temple Judaism, the Pharisaic movement, or any known element of Palestinian Judaism, owes a great deal to the pre-Socratic philosopher Empedocles. By the way, he jumped into Mount Etna. This is one of the stories because he's trying to claim he was a god. Probably not true. And this is from a esoteric manuscript that calls him one of the great lines of ascension. So, when Empedocles, who spoke of the cosmos as being permeated by natural alternations between the four elements in periods of ceaseless combining and falling away, and actually, I was listening to a podcast one time and they said quite convincingly that if you just replaced certain words in Empedocles' fragments, you can have the Big Bang Theory, which is another idea. Everything all was together and then it exploded, and now there's the mutual programs of love and strife. That was his ideas. So Paul highlights this randomness and futility as one of the primary conditions of the old world, the world that Jesus redeems. And astonishingly, he puts this on the Mosaic laws, and he holds this in opposition to Mosaic laws and the rituals of Judaism, as with his warnings to the Galatians. So with us, while we were minors, we were enslaved to the elemental spirits of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as children. Now this point right here, by the way, the stiloi, this phrase is used as the elect in Valentinian Gnosticism. So we have something there. Thus, in Paul's argument, any attempts by non-Jewish Christians to follow the law of the Hebrews would be paramount to return to these primal, unredeemed spiritual powers. The conclusions, even for a Hellenized Jew, would be quite astounding, in that Paul makes a stark attempt to preserve the integrity of the Hellenic cosmos at the expense of the Jewish tradition, which I think is very interesting. And in so doing, Paul leaves two open concerns, which Elaine Pagels has shown would drive the later Gnostic movements. She doesn't put them in these ways. This is sort of my thing, but I think it's very good. So one, based on based on the theory that he lays out, what is the relationship of God the Creator with the world, though created by Him, yet is outside of His power to direct? That's a concern for Paul. That's not really a Jewish concern. And secondly, what is the relationship between the cross and the cosmological redemption, which he brings up in Romans? These two concerns are related. They represent a fundamental split in Paul's redemption, which struggles with the crucifixion as the central event of Messianic time, but is never really able to transcend this to a coherent understanding of the cosmos. Thus, as the writer of Ephesus in Paul's name attempts to provide the answer, as it were, for him, though also not surpassing. In fact, I think he thought that he was doing much better, or she, whoever wrote it, thought that they were doing much better than they did, because I don't think that they actually surpassed anything. And the solution actually came as being an attempt to reconcile both perspectives by expanding the vision of the crucifixion account. And we have here from the book of Ephesians 7:13. In him we have the redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses, according to the riches of his grace that he lavished on us. With all wisdom and insight, he has made known to us the mystery of his will, according to his good pleasure that he set forth in Christ, as a plan for the fullness of time. And that figure is loaded with one, it's a telos, meaning a very strong end, so it's very unique. In Christ we have also obtained an inheritance, having been destined according to the purpose of him who accomplishes all things according to his counsel and will, so that we who were the first to set out our hope on Christ might live for the praise of his glory. In the book of Romans is where many of Paul's thoughts on atonement are most presently concerned, and in particular chapter 3, we find the most robust statements about redemption via the atonement of Christ. The attention to cosmic redemption shifts in Romans back to the lives of the individual faithful, and it might be said to have abandoned the concern for the cosmos at large. Although it really doesn't, but it's not clear about the order in which it was written. A major point of contention for members of the Jerusalem church. As with his writings in Galatians, we see Paul, once again in the first portion of chapter 3, disparage the Mosaic law as being of a lesser or unredeemed state. And he becomes even more dismissive of the spiritual value of the Mosaic covenant. However, there is a break in his thought, where he does not answer the question of the importance of the law as a universal conduit of God's grace, a point highly emphasized in Second Temple Pharisaism, for instance, but he takes a shift towards pistis, faith. And I think that it's also really important to note that the terms that he uses here come from the Hellenic pantheon. We have faith, hope, and love here, the three caritas of the pagan world. So that might be something to keep in mind. This seems to have been one of the major reasons for the calling of the Council of Jerusalem mentioned in Acts 15, where it was decided that it was not necessary for Gentile converts to be circumcised. However, the issue of circumcision was only the most dramatic element in this debate, as the question was much more about the role that individual action, what one does, had in the process of universal salvation. The Jerusalem church, led by the brother of Jesus, James the Just, tended to put a great deal of emphasis on personal behavior in personal redemption and in cosmic redemption, which was diametrically dismissed by Paul. He furthermore insists that his message was purer than those who have known Jesus, as he comes back to time and time again in his writing, saying in Galatians 1, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel I preached is not of human origin. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. I received it by the revelation from Jesus Christ. Paul's message of redemption was so radical that it read to some members of Palestinian Judaism, Palestinian followers of the Jesus movement, as pagan antinomianism. And another point is interest is comparing the different radical readings of the Apostle Paul. As I've said, you can read in Christ there is no sin. So people took that to mean, okay, well, sin all the more. Well, however, for the Jerusalem church and for many of the earliest followers of Jesus, Paul's complex theology, which at various points hinted that it was unavailable except to the pneumatikoi, those of the breath, those of the wisdom, and he writes this actually, you can find this in 1 Corinthians 2:6, where he said, yet among the mature pneumatikoi, we do impart wisdom, though not the wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age who are doomed to pass away. And this particular writing, or this phrasing, was very important in the Gospel of Philip and the development of Valentinian Gnosticism. So there is also this crucial concern for the mystification of Christian doctrines, which would remove others from the actual concern of Christ. This was a concern of the Jerusalem church, for instance. You're teaching all these doctrines, but that's pushing people further and further away from the presence of Christ, etc. And we find these in the writings of the Seosabias, the God-fearers, who... Oh, I didn't have a picture of them. Of the 2nd century, who held the path to perfection often associated with Calum, who was the noumen, or the true essence of Zeus, was identical with the Hebrew deity, and this was according to Juvenal. So thus, this uneasy tension continued at least until the 4th century, where the authority of the Jerusalem church, well, and even before that, after the Roman sacking of Jerusalem, a lot of this starts... basically, the Jerusalem body becomes less of an important thing. And by the 4th century, the teachings of Paul are completely consumed within the writings of the Orthodox and Nestorian churches, who, while they preserved a lot of the importance of liturgical practice, sacraments, they also sort of read Paul in this light. They included him as part of their theology. They worked with him. They read him as a true theologian, but he was always seen within the traditions of the church, which in the more conservative traditions also included tradition as well as the Bible itself. So it's not sola scriptura, but the entirety of the Christian tradition is holy and as important in sources of truth. So I think that when we start learning Paul as a Hellenic thinker, as a Hellenized Jew of a particular point at a particular place in time, with this fear about why he was an apostle, that concern weighing upon him, I think it makes a lot of what he's saying much more interesting and to be honest, I think much more controversial. Because of our insaturation with Pauline messages, particularly in the Protestant tradition, we've sort of forgotten the radicalness of a lot of his statements and the fact that they were not always taken as law and gospel, and that there, in fact, were so many issues with them that they had to be expanded several times later on. And this is interesting for a tradition, as I've said, and I will keep saying, one of the only non-Pauline traditions of Christianity, because Swedenborg did not read Paul as Holy Scripture. And I think that's an interesting point and a great thing to open our discussion with.